Walter Freeman stands on the tarmac, his designer suit wrinkled, watching the plane that ejected him soar into the clouds. His phone buzzes, his net worth just hit $4.2 billion. The airline CEO's smug face flashes across the news on his phone. Perfect timing, Walter whispers. Tomorrow, everything changes. Before we dive into this incredible story of justice and transformation, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you appreciate stories about standing up against discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. Now, let's see how one man's humiliation became the catalyst for an entire industry's awakening. Walter Freeman wasn't born into wealth or privilege. At 78 years old, his weathered hands told the story of a life built from nothing. Growing up in rural Alabama during the height of segregation, young Walter had witnessed the ugliest face of American racism. His father, a telephone line worker, would come home with stories of being denied promotions despite training the very white men who would become his supervisors. "Remember, son," his father would say, looking at Walter's eager face by the light of their modest kerosene lamp, "they can deny you a seat at their table, but nothing stops you from building your own." Those words became the foundation upon which Walter built his empire. Starting with a small telecommunications repair shop in 1972, he identified a critical gap in the market. Black communities and rural areas were consistently underserved by major providers. Walter saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. Freeman Communications began by installing reliable phone lines in neighborhoods the big companies ignored. When the digital revolution arrived, Walter pivoted quickly, becoming one of the first to bring affordable internet to underserved communities. By the early 2000s, his company had grown into a telecommunications giant worth billions. Despite his astronomical success, Walter never forgot his roots. He lived well but not extravagantly, channeling much of his fortune into foundations supporting education in low-income communities. His wife Evelyn had been his partner in both business and life until her passing 5 years ago from cancer. Since then, Walter had thrown himself even more deeply into his work and philanthropy. His grandson Darius, at 32, represented everything Walter had fought to achieve. With degrees from MIT and Harvard Business School, Darius had grown up with privileges Walter could only have dreamed of. Recently, Walter had begun the process of transitioning leadership of Freeman Communications to Darius, believing it was time for new energy and ideas. "Grandpa, you can't just let these things slide anymore," Darius would argue whenever Walter encountered discrimination, which still happened with alarming frequency despite his wealth and status. "Your generation suffered in silence so mine wouldn't have to. We need to call this behavior out." Walter would simply smile at his grandson's fire. "There are many ways to fight a battle, son. Sometimes the loudest voice isn't the most effective. Success is the best revenge, but justice is sweeter." This philosophy had guided Walter throughout his life. He preferred strategic action to public confrontation. When a luxury car dealership had a salesman follow him around suspiciously, Walter didn't create a scene, he bought the dealership and implemented new training protocols. When a restaurant host tried seating him by the kitchen despite empty tables with views, Walter didn't complain, he became an investor and restructured their customer service approach. Today, Walter was boarding Meridian Airlines flight FS-447 from Atlanta to Chicago, where he would meet Darius for an important charity gala benefiting inner-city tech education. Little did he know, this routine flight would become the catalyst for his most significant battle yet, and his most impactful victory. As he settled into his first-class seat, Walter straightened his custom-tailored suit jacket and opened his tablet to review his speech for tomorrow's event. The other passengers in first class were predominantly white businessmen who barely glanced in his direction. Walter was used to this invisible treatment, sometimes being overlooked was easier than being seen through prejudiced eyes. What he couldn't know was that in just 30 minutes, he would be standing alone on the tarmac, watching that very plane take off without him, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to racial equality. Walter settled comfortably into Seat 2A in the first-class cabin of Meridian Airlines Flight FS-447. He'd been a platinum-level frequent flyer for over 20 years, accumulating millions of miles as he built his telecommunications empire across continents. Flying first class wasn't a luxury for Walter, it was a practical choice that allowed him to work efficiently while traveling. As other passengers boarded, Walter noticed the typical pattern. Several white passengers nodded to him with the automatic courtesy of strangers sharing premium space. Others pointedly avoided eye contact, as if questioning his presence in first class. Walter had long ago learned to ignore these microaggressions, focusing instead on reviewing quarterly projections on his tablet. Flight attendant Heather Whitman, a blonde woman in her mid-40s with a practiced smile, moved efficiently through the cabin, offering pre-flight beverages to the first-class passengers. "Good afternoon, sir. Champagne? Orange juice?" she asked the young tech executive in 1A. "Sparkling water, please," the man replied without looking up from his laptop. Heather nodded and served him promptly before moving to the passengers across the aisle. Walter waited patiently, tablet in hand. When Heather passed by his seat without acknowledgement, he assumed she'd return. 5 minutes later, she had served everyone in first class except Walter. "Excuse me," Walter said politely as Heather passed again. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Heather's eyes flickered over him briefly. "I'll be back around shortly," she said, then disappeared into the galley. Walter returned to his work, unbothered. 10 minutes passed. The boarding process was nearly complete, and Heather had returned to check on several other passengers, refreshing drinks and hanging jackets. She had not returned to Walter's seat. "Pardon me," Walter tried again, his voice gentle but firm as Heather passed. "I'd still like that water when you have a moment." "I'm quite busy right now, sir," Heather replied, her tone noticeably cooler than with other passengers. "We'll begin beverage service after takeoff." Walter nodded, though he noticed the businessman across the aisle had just received a fresh scotch. This wasn't Walter's first experience with selective service, and ordinarily, he might have let it go. But today, after a tiring week of meetings, the 78-year-old was genuinely thirsty. When Heather passed again, Walter raised his hand slightly. "I apologize for the interruption, but I've been waiting for water for quite some time now. Could you please?" "Sir," Heather cut him off sharply, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I've told you we'll begin full service shortly. I need you to be patient and stop being aggressive." Walter blinked in surprise. "Aggressive? I don't believe I was. Is there a problem here?" A white passenger from the business class section had approached, inserting himself into the situation. Thomas Kensington, as Walter would later learn, was a mid-level banking executive who had appointed himself unofficial air marshal. "This man keeps demanding immediate service," Heather explained to Kensington, as if Walter weren't present. "He's being disruptive." "I simply asked for water," Walter clarified calmly. 3 times now. "See how he's talking back?" Kensington said. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that causes problems on flights these days." By now, several passengers were watching the interaction. A few had phones discreetly recording, including Amara Jackson, a 26-year-old journalist seated in business class who recognized Walter Freeman immediately. The situation escalated when Captain Bradley Reynolds, a stern-faced man in his 50s, emerged from the cockpit, summoned by a call from Heather. "What seems to be the issue here?" Captain Reynolds asked, standing over Walter's seat with arms crossed. "This passenger is being belligerent and making the cabin crew uncomfortable," Heather stated firmly. "I've simply been asking for a glass of water," Walter explained, maintaining his composure. "I've been ignored repeatedly while other passengers receive service." Captain Reynolds barely listened to Walter's explanation. "Sir, if you're causing disruptions before we even take off, I have concerns about your behavior during this flight." "I assure you, there's no cause for concern," Walter said. "I'm a frequent flyer with Meridian, just asking to be treated like the other passengers." "He's playing the race card," Kensington muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Captain Reynolds made a quick decision. Sir, I believe it would be best for everyone if you deplaned and took a later flight when you're feeling more cooperative. Walter stared in disbelief. You're removing me from this flight because I asked for water. I'm removing you because you're creating a disturbance that could compromise flight safety, Reynolds stated firmly. Security will escort you off. 2 airport security officers appeared at the captain's signal. Walter, recognizing the potential danger in resistance, particularly for a black man in America, calmly gathered his belongings. I want your names, Walter said quietly to the flight attendant and captain. And your employee identification numbers. Are you threatening us now? Heather asked, voice rising theatrically. No, ma'am. I'm preparing to file a formal complaint, Walter replied, his dignity intact despite the humiliation burning in his chest. As security escorted Walter down the aisle, he noticed a young white man being escorted in the opposite direction, toward first class. Looks like we have an open seat in first after all, Heather was saying cheerfully. We'd like to upgrade you today, Mr. Peterson. Walter walked silently down the jetway, memorizing the names on the crew badges, noting the flight number, time, and date. Throughout his life, he had faced discrimination in many forms, but rarely so blatantly, and never with such potential witnesses and documentation. From the terminal window, Walter watched as Flight FS-447 pulled away from the gate. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a stock alert informing him that his tech company's latest acquisition had been finalized, pushing his net worth to $4.2 billion. On the terminal television, a business news program featured the smiling face of Meridian Airline CEO Wesley Blackwell, discussing the company's commitment to exceptional customer experience. Walter Freeman's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked from his phone to the departing plane. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't just file a complaint that would disappear into corporate bureaucracy. This time, he had the resources and resolve to create change that no one at Meridian Airlines could possibly anticipate. The sleek private car glided through Atlanta traffic as Walter made calls from the back seat. He declined Meridian's offer of rebooking, instead arranging his own transportation to Chicago. His first call was to Darius. They did what? His grandson's voice exploded through the speaker. Walter held the phone slightly away from his ear. Grandpa, we're suing them into oblivion. Today. I'm calling Patricia right now. Darius, take a breath, Walter advised, his own voice steady despite the anger and humiliation still simmering beneath his composed exterior. I've already contacted Patricia. She's meeting me at the Ritz in an hour. This is exactly what I've been talking about, Darius continued, his outrage palpable even through the phone. Your generation keeps turning the other cheek while these people think they can treat us however they want. No more passes, Grandpa. Not for you. Walter gazed out the window at the Atlanta skyline, a city transformed since his childhood yet still harboring the shadows of its segregated past. I don't intend to give anyone a pass, son. But there are many forms of justice. By the time Walter checked into the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton, his longtime attorney Patricia Reynolds was already waiting in the lobby. Despite sharing a last name with the Meridian captain, Patricia was no relation, a fact that would become important in the coming legal battle. Walter, Patricia greeted him, her no-nonsense demeanor softened by genuine concern. At 65, she had been handling Freeman Communications legal matters for over 30 years. I've already spoken with 3 passengers who witnessed the incident. Their videos are circulating online. Walter raised an eyebrow. Already? Patricia nodded, following him into the elevator. A journalist named Amara Jackson was on board. She recognized you and started recording as soon as the confrontation began. Her initial tweet has over 50,000 retweets. In the suite, Patricia opened her laptop to show Walter the growing social media firestorm. The hashtag Justice for Walter Freeman was trending, alongside hashtag Meridian Airlines discrimination. Video clips showed Walter's calm demeanor contrasted with the flight attendants' increasingly aggressive posture. Meridian's PR team issued this statement 20 minutes ago, Patricia said, displaying a corporate Twitter post. Meridian Airlines is aware of an incident involving a passenger on flight FS 447. We take all customer concerns seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. The comfort and safety of all passengers remains our top priority. Walter read the non-apology with a slight shake of his head. Standard corporate deflection. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no specifics, no actual commitment to action. His phone rang, a Chicago number he didn't recognize. Patricia gestured that she would step onto the balcony to give him privacy. Mr. Freeman, this is Amara Jackson with the Chicago Tribune. I was on your flight today and witnessed everything. I'd like to get your statement for an article I'm writing. Walter considered for a moment. Ms. Jackson, I appreciate your interest, but I'll need to decline comment at this time. I understand, sir. But people should know how Meridian treated one of America's most successful black businessmen. Your story matters. Perhaps, Walter replied thoughtfully. But this isn't just about me. When the time is right, I'll have more to say. Until then, I trust you'll report the facts as you observed them. After ending the call, Walter stood at the window, watching the sunset paint Atlanta's skyline in gold and crimson. His mind drifted back to similar incidents throughout his life, being forced to use separate facilities as a child in Alabama, being denied service at restaurants as a young man, being mistaken for a waiter at business functions even after his company went public. Each indignity had fueled his determination rather than diminishing it. Each barrier had become a building block in his path to success. This latest incident would be no different, except in scale and consequence. As night fell, Patricia finished coordinating with the legal team while Walter watched the news coverage of the incident spreading across networks. His phone rang again, this time displaying Meridian Airlines' corporate number. Mr. Freeman, this is Wesley Blackwell, CEO of Meridian Airlines. The voice oozed practiced contrition. I wanted to personally express my deepest regrets about today's unfortunate incident. I appreciate the call, Mr. Blackwell, Walter replied evenly. We pride ourselves on providing exceptional service to all our passengers. What happened today falls far short of our standards. I'd like to offer you our sincere apology, lifetime platinum status, and 1 million frequent flyer miles as a gesture of goodwill. Walter's voice remained measured. And what about the employees involved? We're conducting a thorough investigation, Blackwell said smoothly. Appropriate action will be taken once we've gathered all the facts. I see. And what about your company's broader issues with discriminatory treatment? This isn't an isolated incident, Mr. Blackwell. A pause. We have comprehensive diversity training programs in place, Mr. Freeman. I can assure you that discrimination has no place at Meridian Airlines. Walter watched the lights of aircraft taking off and landing at the distant airport. Mr. Blackwell, I don't want your miles or your status upgrade. I don't want your money. I want change. Perhaps we could discuss this further in person, Blackwell suggested. I could fly to Atlanta tomorrow. That won't be necessary, Walter interrupted. But I do appreciate your call. Good night, Mr. Blackwell. After hanging up, Walter turned to find Patricia watching him with a knowing smile. You have that look, Walter. What look? He asked innocently. The same look you had before you revolutionized rural telecommunications. The same look you had before acquiring that tech startup everyone said would fail. She closed her laptop. You're planning something much bigger than a lawsuit, aren't you? Walter's eyes gleamed with purpose. Patricia, I want you to assemble the team. Legal, financial, PR, everyone. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. What should I tell them it's regarding? Walter smiled slightly. Tell them it's about justice. And transformation. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ritz-Carlton's conference room as Walter addressed his hastily assembled team of advisors. Despite the early hour, everyone was alert, aware that Walter Freeman never called emergency meetings without significant cause. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Walter began, his voice steady and purposeful. "By now, you've all seen the news about yesterday's incident." Heads nodded around the table. The team included Patricia Reynolds, his chief legal counsel, Marcus Tate, head of financial operations, Sophia Washington, public relations director, and via secure video link, Darius from Chicago. "What happened yesterday was unfortunately not an isolated incident," Walter continued. "Not for me personally, and certainly not for countless others who lack my resources and platform. The difference is, we now have an opportunity to create meaningful change." Marcus slid a folder across the table. "Our team worked through the night on this. Meridian Airlines is in a precarious financial position. They've overextended on fleet modernization while facing increased competition from budget carriers. Their stock has been sliding for 3 consecutive quarters." Walter nodded. "And their response to this PR crisis?" Sophia consulted her tablet. "Standard corporate damage control. They've issued a slightly stronger statement this morning, suspending the flight attendant pending investigation. Social media remains heavily negative, with boycott calls gaining traction. They're vulnerable. Which brings me to my decision," Walter said, standing to look out at the Atlanta skyline. "I intend to acquire a controlling interest in Meridian Airlines." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in surprised comments. "Walter, that would require billions," Marcus started. "4 billion, approximately, for a 51% stake," Walter confirmed. "Well within our capacity, especially if we leverage Freeman Communications stock." Patricia leaned forward. "This is about more than justice for one incident, isn't it?" Walter turned back to the table, his expression serious. "When I was 10 years old, my father took me to Montgomery to hear Dr. King speak. Afterward, we got caught in a rainstorm waiting for the segregated bus. A white taxi driver refused to take us, even with my father offering triple the fare." He paused, the memory still vivid after nearly 7 decades. "We stood in that rain for 2 hours. When we finally got home, I was angry, crying. My father sat me down and said something I never forgot: 'Son, there are 2 kinds of change in this world. There's the kind where you change yourself to survive the system, and there's the kind where you change the system itself. The second kind is harder, takes longer, but it's the only one that matters in the end.'" Walter looked at each person around the table. "Throughout my career, I've fought discrimination by building my own table when I wasn't welcome at theirs. But sometimes, that's not enough. Sometimes, you need to transform the existing structures from within." Darius spoke up from the video screen. "Grandpa, I support you completely, but I'm concerned about the risks. This would be the largest acquisition you've ever attempted, and in an industry you've never operated in." "Valid concerns," Walter acknowledged. "Which is why I need each of you to think carefully about whether you're with me. This won't be easy." Marcus pulled up financial projections on the conference room screen. "If we move quickly and quietly, we could begin acquiring shares at current market prices. With their stock depressed from recent performance issues and now this PR disaster, the timing is actually favorable." "But Walter," Patricia cautioned, "a hostile takeover of this magnitude will be met with significant resistance. The old guard won't surrender control easily, especially to a black owner. This could get ugly." Walter nodded. "I'm counting on it. Sometimes systems only change when their dysfunction is fully exposed." The team spent the next hour discussing logistics, strategies, and potential pitfalls. As the meeting concluded, Walter asked everyone to leave except Darius on the video call. "You've been unusually quiet, Darius. What's really on your mind?" Walter asked his grandson. Darius hesitated. "I'm worried about your health, Grandpa. The stress of this fight at your age." Walter smiled softly. "I appreciate your concern. But I'm not doing this just for me, or even just for you. I'm doing this for that young flight attendant's children, who are learning from her example. I'm doing this for that captain's grandchildren, who deserve a better world than the one he's maintaining. And I'm doing this for every person who's ever swallowed their dignity just to get from point A to point B. After a moment of reflection, Walter added, besides, what better way to spend my remaining years than fighting one last meaningful battle? The determination in Walter's eyes silenced any further objections from Darius. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice, it was about legacy. What do you think about Walter's decision? Would you have taken legal action instead of attempting to buy the airline? Comment number 1 if you believe Walter's approach will create more lasting change, or number 2 if you think a high-profile lawsuit would have been more effective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and transformation. The real question is, how exactly would Walter Freeman execute such an ambitious plan against a corporation determined to protect itself? And what would happen when the airline discovered who was buying up their shares? Let's continue. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a high-stakes chess match, with Walter Freeman making moves that remained invisible to his opponent. Operating from a secure office suite in downtown Atlanta, Walter's financial team executed a sophisticated strategy to quietly accumulate Meridian Airlines stock. We've established 7 separate investment vehicles through various subsidiaries, Marcus Tate explained during their daily morning briefing. None traceable to Freeman Communications or to you personally. Walter nodded, studying the real-time acquisition data on the large display screen. Current position: 12% and climbing, Marcus replied. We're keeping individual purchases below reporting thresholds. The market sees multiple unrelated investors, not a coordinated effort. Meanwhile, the public narrative around Meridian Airlines continued to deteriorate. Sophia Washington's PR team had discreetly reached out to journalists covering the story, providing background information on Freeman's accomplishments and philanthropy without directly connecting him to any potential acquisition. Amara Jackson's feature piece runs tomorrow in the Tribune, Sophia informed Walter. She's expanded beyond your incident to investigate systemic issues at Meridian. Former employees have come forward with similar stories of discriminatory practices. Walter raised an eyebrow. You didn't prompt those testimonials, did you? Didn't need to, Sophia replied. Once the first video went viral, people started sharing their experiences unprompted. Turns out Meridian has quite a history. Patricia entered the room with her own update. Meridian's legal team is scrambling. They've offered a 7-figure settlement with an NDA. Walter shook his head. Decline. Respectfully. They'll increase the offer, Patricia warned. It's not about the money, Walter reminded her. It never was. By the end of the second week, Walter's team had acquired nearly 20% of Meridian's outstanding shares. The stock price had begun to fluctuate erratically as market analysts noticed the unusual trading patterns. Financial blogs are speculating about a potential takeover, Marcus reported. No names mentioned yet, but Meridian's board has called an emergency meeting. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Time for the next phase. Arrange meetings with the top 5 institutional shareholders. These meetings proved crucial. Walter personally met with representatives from major investment funds that collectively controlled another 15% of Meridian stock. His reputation as a business visionary preceded him, and his plans for transforming Meridian resonated particularly with younger fund managers. The airline industry is overdue for disruption, Walter told them. Not just in technology, but in corporate culture. Meridian's recent issues are symptoms of deeper problems that impact their bottom line. I'm offering a path to both ethical and financial improvement. 4 of the 5 funds agreed to support Walter's bid, giving him effective control of over 30% of the company, enough to trigger corporate disclosure requirements and bring his acquisition effort into the open. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. Telecommunications billionaire Walter Freeman seeks controlling stake in troubled Meridian Airlines. Meridian CEO Wesley Blackwell was caught completely off guard. His CNBC interview that afternoon showed a man struggling to maintain composure. While we welcome all investors, This appears to be an opportunistic attempt to capitalize on a single unfortunate incident that isn't representative of our company culture, Blackwell stated tensely. Meridian has a proud 70-year history, and we intend to remain independent. Behind the scenes, Meridian's board authorized aggressive countermeasures, including a poison pill provision that would dilute shares if any single entity acquired more than 40% of the company. Walter had anticipated this move. Classic defensive maneuver, he told his team. But they're forgetting something important. What's that? Darius asked, now physically present in Atlanta to support his grandfather. Public opinion, Walter replied. In this climate, their defensive tactics will be viewed as exactly what they are, a privileged organization fighting to maintain the status quo against change led by a black businessman after they discriminated against him. Not a good look. He was right. When Meridian announced their defensive measures, the backlash was immediate. Hashtags like #LetWalterLead and #TransformMeridian began trending. More importantly, consumers began choosing other airlines, accelerating Meridian's financial problems. By the end of the third week, Walter's team had secured commitments from shareholders representing 47% of the company. They were tantalizingly close to the controlling stake they sought. The physical toll on Walter became increasingly apparent, however. Though he never complained, Darius noticed his grandfather taking more frequent breaks and occasionally wincing from back pain. The stress of the high-stakes acquisition was considerable, even for a man with Walter's experience. "Grandpa, you need to rest," Darius insisted one evening, finding Walter still working at 11 p.m. "I'll rest when it's done," Walter replied, not looking up from the documents he was reviewing. "The team can handle the details. That's why you hired them." Walter finally looked up, removing his reading glasses. "You know why I can't step back now, don't you?" Darius nodded slowly. "Because you've never had the luxury of showing weakness." "That's right," Walter confirmed quietly. "Not as a black man in America, and certainly not as a black businessman. The moment I show any crack in my resolve, they'll swoop in like vultures. I've seen it happen too many times." The truth of his words hung heavily in the room. Despite his billions, despite his accomplishments, Walter still operated in a world that granted him less margin for error than his white counterparts. The chess game intensified when Meridian's management began reaching out to potential, white knight, investors, friendly parties who might counter Walter's bid. Several prominent airlines expressed interest, sensing an opportunity to eliminate a competitor through acquisition. "We have a leak," Marcus announced during an emergency evening meeting. "Someone from one of the investment funds tipped off Meridian's board about our strategy for the shareholders' meeting next week." Walter remained unperturbed. "Adjust accordingly. Move up our timeline. That means going public with our full proposal tomorrow," Patricia cautioned. "We'd planned to wait until we had the full 51% locked down." "Sometimes you have to force your opponent's hand," Walter replied. "Prepare the press release and regulatory filings. Tomorrow, we lay all our cards on the table." That night, alone in his hotel suite, Walter stood at the window overlooking Atlanta. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Amara Jackson. I have information about Captain Reynolds you need to see. Can we meet?" Walter studied the message thoughtfully. Journalists had been trying to get exclusive comments from him for weeks. But something about this felt different. "Send the information securely to my attorney, Patricia Reynolds," he replied. "If it's relevant, we'll be in touch." Minutes later, Patricia called. "Walter, you need to see this. Amara Jackson has obtained Captain Reynolds' personnel file from a whistleblower at Meridian. There's a pattern of discriminatory incidents spanning 15 years, all buried by management." Walter's expression hardened. "This isn't just about one flight attendant and one captain, is it?" "No," Patricia confirmed. "This is systemic. And there's more. Reynolds is apparently Wesley Blackwell's former brother-in-law. Family connections have kept him protected despite multiple complaints." Walter sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of confirmation. What had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident but part of a corporate culture that enabled and protected discriminatory behavior. "Thank Ms. Jackson for the information," Walter instructed. "And tell her I'll have a statement for her after tomorrow's board meeting." As Walter finally prepared for bed, his phone rang one last time. It was Wesley Blackwell himself. "Freeman," the CEO's voice was tense but controlled. "This has gone far enough. Name your price to walk away." Walter smiled slightly at the desperation evident in Blackwell's tone. "Mr. Blackwell, you still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation or a shakedown. This is a transition of leadership. You know nothing about running an airline." "Perhaps," Walter conceded. "But I know a great deal about running a company with integrity. Something Meridian could use right now." After hanging up, Walter sent a final message to his team: "Tomorrow, we make history." The chess game was approaching its final moves. Walter had positioned his pieces strategically across the board. Now it was time for checkmate. The Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters in Atlanta projected power and stability, a 40-story glass tower stretching toward the sky, its logo emblazoned prominently near the top. In the executive boardroom on the 39th floor, tension hung in the air like a gathering storm. The emergency board meeting had been called to address the Freeman situation, as CEO Wesley Blackwell had labeled it in his memo. 14 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces grave as they reviewed financial projections showing the company's accelerating decline since the incident. "Gentlemen, ladies," Blackwell began, his voice strained despite his attempt at confidence. "We face an unprecedented threat to our company's independence. In the 3 weeks since the unfortunate incident involving Mr. Freeman, our stock has declined 17%. More concerning is the coordinated attempt by Freeman and his associates to acquire a controlling interest in Meridian." Edward Whitfield, the longest-serving board member at 74, cleared his throat. "The poison pill provision should prevent an outright hostile takeover, Wesley." "Under normal circumstances, yes," Blackwell conceded. "But Freeman has been extraordinarily creative in structuring his acquisition. He's garnered support from institutional investors representing nearly 47% of outstanding shares. He's just 4% away from effective control." The boardroom doors opened unexpectedly, and all heads turned as Walter Freeman himself walked in, followed by Darius and Patricia Reynolds. The board members stared in shocked silence. "Mr. Freeman," Blackwell sputtered, "this is a closed board meeting. You have no right." "Actually, I do," Walter replied calmly, placing a document folder on the table. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, I am the beneficial owner of 27% of Meridian Airlines common stock. SEC regulations entitle significant shareholders to representation at board meetings where their interests may be materially affected." Patricia distributed copies of the regulatory filings confirming Walter's status. Board members flipped through the documents with growing alarm. "This is highly irregular," protested Catherine Montgomery, one of only 2 women on the board. "We should adjourn until our attorneys can review these claims." "My attorneys are available for consultation right now," Walter offered reasonably, gesturing to Patricia. "But perhaps before we get lost in legal technicalities, we might address the actual issues at hand." Blackwell's face had reddened considerably. "What exactly do you want, Freeman? If this is about extracting a settlement for your alleged mistreatment." "Alleged?" Walter interrupted, his voice hardening slightly. "There are 17 videos of the incident from different passenger perspectives. The facts aren't in dispute, Mr. Blackwell." Walter took a seat at the empty chair at the far end of the table. Darius and Patricia remained standing behind him. "What I want is simple," Walter continued. "I want Meridian Airlines to become the industry leader in equitable treatment, diverse representation, and customer dignity. I want meaningful changes in hiring, training, and accountability. And I want new leadership to implement these changes." "You want my job," Blackwell said flatly. "I want the right person in your job," Walter corrected. Someone committed to transformation rather than damage control. Edward Whitfield leaned forward. Mr. Freeman, while we respect your accomplishments in telecommunications, airline operations require specialized expertise. Indeed they do, Walter agreed. Which is why I've assembled a transition team that includes former executives from 3 major carriers. This isn't about my ego, Mr. Whitfield. It's about changing a corporate culture that allowed discrimination to become standard operating procedure. Blackwell laughed dismissively. One isolated incident with a difficult passenger does not constitute a pattern. I was hoping you'd say that, Walter replied, nodding to Patricia, who distributed another set of documents. This is a summary of discrimination complaints filed against Meridian over the past decade. 173 formal complaints, 42 of which involved the same flight attendant who confronted me. 37 incidents involved Captain Reynolds. The board members flipped through the pages with growing discomfort. And here's the most telling statistic, Walter continued. Of those 173 complaints, 0 resulted in termination. Only 12 led to any disciplinary action whatsoever. The rest were dismissed, settled with NDAs, or simply ignored. Catherine Montgomery looked up from the documents, visibly disturbed. If these figures are accurate. They are, Walter assured her. Compiled from EEOC filings, court records, and internal documents provided by current and former Meridian employees. Even if we accept these claims, Blackwell interjected, your proposed takeover isn't the solution. We can implement diversity training, review our complaint procedures. You've had decades to do that, Walter cut in. Instead, you've created a system that protects people like Captain Reynolds, who happens to be your former brother-in-law. A murmur ran through the board members. This was clearly news to many of them. That's completely irrelevant, Blackwell snapped. Is it? Walter asked. Then perhaps we should bring in Captain Reynolds and Ms. Whitman to explain their actions directly to the board. Blackwell looked to his executive assistant hovering near the door. That won't be necessary. Actually, I think it is, came a voice from a board member who had been silent until now. James Chen, representing one of the institutional investors, had been watching the exchange carefully. I'd like to hear from the employees involved. After a tense silence, Blackwell nodded reluctantly to his assistant, who left to summon the flight crew members. While they waited, Walter addressed the board directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concern about an outsider gaining control of your company. Change is always uncomfortable. But consider this, Meridian stock has underperformed industry averages for 7 consecutive quarters. Customer satisfaction ratings have dropped to second lowest among major carriers. Employee turnover is at an all-time high. Even before this incident, your company was struggling. Several board members exchanged glances, unable to refute these facts. I'm offering a path forward, Walter continued. Not just ethical compliance, but a genuine transformation that will distinguish Meridian in a crowded marketplace. Diversity isn't just a moral imperative, it's good business. The boardroom doors opened again, and Captain Bradley Reynolds entered, followed by flight attendant Heather Whitman. Both appeared uncomfortable, clearly not having expected to face Walter Freeman himself. Captain Reynolds, Ms. Whitman, Walter greeted them with professional courtesy. Thank you for joining us. Reynolds straightened his uniform jacket defensively. We were told our presence was required. Indeed, Walter replied. The board is reviewing the events of Flight FS 447 3 weeks ago. I believe your perspective would be valuable. Everything was documented in my incident report, Reynolds stated flatly. Yes, I've read it, Walter nodded. You claimed I was being aggressive and disruptive. I'm curious what specific behaviors led you to that conclusion. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendant reported that you were making repeated demands and creating a disturbance. I asked for water 3 times over 30 minutes, Walter clarified. Is that typically considered aggressive behavior? Before Reynolds could answer, Heather Whitman interjected, "You were using a tone that made me uncomfortable." "A tone?" Walter repeated. "Could you describe this tone? Was I shouting? Using profanity? Making threats?" "No, but..." Whitman struggled to articulate her perception. "You were being insistent." "I see," Walter said thoughtfully. "Ms. Whitman, do you recall serving other first-class passengers beverages before takeoff that day?" "That's standard procedure," she acknowledged. "Including the gentleman in seat 1A? And those across the aisle from me?" Whitman's eyes darted to Blackwell, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I don't specifically recall." "Fortunately, the videos are quite clear on this point," Walter noted. "Every first-class passenger received pre-flight beverages except me. When I asked, politely, according to multiple witnesses, I was repeatedly ignored. Why was that, Mess Whitman?" The flight attendant's composure began to crack. "I was busy with other duties." "Yet you found time to serve other passengers," Walter pressed. "Including providing a second scotch to the gentleman across the aisle immediately after telling me you were too busy to bring water." Catherine Montgomery interjected, "Mr. Freeman, what is your point with this line of questioning?" Walter turned to address the entire board. "My point, Ms. Montgomery, is that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was the product of implicit bias at best, and overt discrimination at worst. And instead of addressing it, Meridian's leadership has chosen to defend and protect the employees responsible." Captain Reynolds had been growing increasingly agitated. "This is ridiculous. 30 years of service, and my career is being threatened because some entitled passenger couldn't wait for his water." The room fell silent at Reynolds' outburst. Walter simply raised an eyebrow, allowing the captain's words to hang in the air. "Entitled?" Walter finally repeated quietly. "Captain Reynolds, do you consider a paying first-class passenger entitled for expecting the same service provided to everyone else in the cabin?" Reynolds realized his mistake too late. "That's not what I meant." "I think it's exactly what you meant," Walter replied. "And that's precisely the problem we're here to address." Walter turned back to the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have a choice to make today. You can continue down the path you've been on, defending discriminatory behavior, losing customers, and watching your company's value decline. Or you can embrace transformation." He slid a formal proposal across the table. "My offer is straightforward. I will provide the capital needed to implement comprehensive reforms, refresh your fleet, and rebuild your brand. In exchange, I ask for a controlling interest and the authority to appoint new leadership committed to these goals." For the next hour, the board deliberated while Walter, Darius, and Patricia waited in an adjacent conference room. The discussion inside was heated, with raised voices occasionally audible through the walls. Finally, they were called back in. Edward Whitfield, now acting as spokesman, addressed Walter directly. "Mr. Freeman, the board has voted to accept your proposal with certain conditions regarding operational continuity and employee protections." The vote was 9-5 in favor. Walter nodded, noting which board members looked displeased with the outcome. Those would be the ones to watch carefully during the transition. Wesley Blackwell sat stunned, his future suddenly uncertain. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "No, Mr. Blackwell," Walter replied. "This is accountability. Something long overdue at Meridian Airlines." As the meeting concluded, Captain Reynolds approached Walter by the elevator. "You won't get away with this," he said quietly. "People won't accept someone like you running things." Walter met the captain's gaze steadily. "That's where you're wrong, Captain. The world is changing. And now, so is Meridian Airlines." As Walter, Darius, and Patricia descended in the elevator, Darius squeezed his grandfather's shoulder. "You did it." Walter shook his head slightly. "No, son. We've only just begun." 1 year to the day after Walter Freeman was ejected from Meridian Airlines Flight FS-447, he stood before a crowd of employees, industry leaders, and media at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Behind him, gleaming in the morning sun, sat the first aircraft bearing the new logo of Freeman Global Airways, formerly Meridian Airlines. The rebranding represented the final step in the company's transformation, symbolizing the complete break from its troubled past and the new direction under Freeman leadership. The new livery featured a stylized phoenix rising from abstract waves, representing rebirth and the connecting of diverse global communities. A year ago today, Walter began, his voice steady despite his advancing age. I stood on a tarmac not unlike this one, watching a plane take off without me after I was removed for simply asking to be treated with the same dignity as other passengers. The crowd, familiar with the story that had made national headlines, listened intently. Today, I stand before you not as a victim of discrimination, but as the architect of transformation. Not alone, but alongside thousands of dedicated employees who embraced a vision of what this airline, and indeed, this industry, could become. Walter gestured to Darius, who stood nearby with the executive leadership team, notably the most diverse in the industry. Today, I officially retire and pass full leadership to my grandson, Darius Freeman, who has proven himself not just as my successor but as a visionary in his own right. Applause erupted as Darius stepped forward to embrace his grandfather. The elder Freeman's health had stabilized, but at 79, he was ready to step back from daily operations while remaining as chairman emeritus. After Darius made brief remarks about continuing the company's commitment to transformation, a surprising announcement followed. Walter had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to business innovation and civil rights advancement. This recognition belongs not to me alone, Walter said when the announcement was made, but to everyone who has been part of this journey, including those who initially stood against us but found the courage to change. He gestured toward the audience where Captain Bradley Reynolds sat with his daughter and her fiancé, the black pilot whose relationship had helped transform Reynolds' perspective. Nearby sat Heather Whitman, now a senior executive responsible for customer experience training. Even former CEO Wesley Blackwell was present, having publicly acknowledged the positive impact of the changes he had once resisted. The ceremony concluded with the announcement of the Freeman Foundation for Equity in Transportation, a $500 million initiative to support diversity in aviation and ensure equal access and treatment for all travelers. As attendees moved to the reception area, Walter found a quiet moment with Amara Jackson, whose reporting had helped document the transformation from its controversial beginnings to its industry-changing impact. "Your final feature is published today, I understand?" Walter asked. Amara nodded. "A 1-year retrospective. I wanted to wait until I could include the rebranding in your retirement." "And your conclusions?" "That what happened with Freeman Global Airways isn't just a corporate success story," Amara replied thoughtfully. "It's a template for how meaningful change can occur in established institutions, through clear vision, consistent accountability, and leadership that values transformation over retribution." Walter nodded appreciatively. "You've captured it well." As they talked, an announcement came over the airport speakers, now boarding, Freeman Global Airways inaugural flight GF001 to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. "Speaking of which," Walter said with a smile, "I believe that's my flight." The inaugural flight had been specifically scheduled and numbered to mirror the flight from which Walter had been removed a year earlier. But this time, he would be boarding as the company's honored founder rather than an unwelcome passenger. At the gate, Walter was greeted by a flight crew that reflected the airline's commitment to diversity, men and women of various races, ages, and backgrounds, all trained under the company's revolutionary equity programs. The captain, a young black woman who had benefited from Freeman's scholarship program, welcomed Walter personally. "It's an honor to fly you today, Mr. Freeman. Your seat in first class is ready whenever you'd like to board." Walter smiled at the symmetry of the moment. "Thank you, Captain. I believe I'm ready now." As Walter settled into his first-class seat, a flight attendant immediately approached. "Mr. Freeman, would you like still water, sparkling water, or perhaps champagne before takeoff? Walter's eyes twinkled. Still water would be perfect, thank you. The attendant returned promptly with the water, served with dignified courtesy, the same treatment now extended to every passenger, regardless of appearance, background, or status. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Walter gazed out the window at the airport where his transformation journey had begun. The humiliation he had experienced that day had been transformed into purpose, and that purpose into lasting change. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky, climbing through scattered clouds into clear blue. Below, the landscape of Georgia gave way to the patchwork of America, diverse, complex, imperfect yet filled with possibility. Walter recalled his father's words from so long ago, there are two kinds of change in this world. There's the kind where you change yourself to survive the system, and there's the kind where you change the system itself. He had accomplished the latter, creating transformation that would outlast him, benefiting countless travelers and employees for generations to come. The incident that might have been merely another indignity in a lifetime of navigating racism had instead become the catalyst for systemic change. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Darius took the seat beside him, having arranged to join this symbolic flight. "How does it feel?" Darius asked quietly. Walter considered the question. "It feels like completion," he finally answered. The circle closed. The journey fulfilled. Darius nodded, understanding the depth of emotion behind his grandfather's simple words. "You know," Walter continued after a moment, "when I was standing on that tarmac a year ago, watching that plane take off without me, I didn't just feel anger or humiliation. I felt responsibility. Not just to fight for myself, but to ensure no one else would have that experience again." "You've done that," Darius affirmed. "And more." Walter smiled slightly. "We've done that. All of us together." As the flight continued toward Chicago, Walter reflected on the true nature of justice. It wasn't found in punishment or retribution, but in transformation, of systems, cultures, and sometimes even of those who had perpetuated injustice. The flight attendant approached again. "Mr. Freeman, the captain has invited you to visit the cockpit if you'd like." Minutes later, Walter stood in the state-of-the-art cockpit of the aircraft, observing the diverse flight crew working together with professional precision. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Freeman," Captain Keisha Williams said warmly. "It's an honor to have you on our inaugural flight." "The honor is mine, Captain Williams," Walter replied. "Seeing you in that chair means everything we've worked for is becoming reality." Back in his seat, Walter gazed out at the clouds below, thinking about the legacy he was leaving behind. Not just a successful company or personal wealth, but a transformation in how people were treated, with dignity that transcended race, gender, age, or status. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Walter felt profound gratitude. The $4.2 billion he had invested in acquiring and transforming Meridian Airlines, now Freeman Global Airways, had yielded returns far more valuable than money could measure. The aircraft touched down smoothly at O'Hare International Airport, completing the journey that had been denied to Walter a year earlier. As he deplaned, Walter was greeted by a crowd of employees, many of whom had benefited directly from the company's transformation. "Mr. Freeman," one young ground crew member said, shaking his hand, "my mother was a flight attendant for Meridian for 20 years. She always said she stayed despite the discrimination because someone needed to be there to help the next generation. She would have loved to see this day." Walter smiled, deeply moved. "What's your name, young man?" "Michael Reynolds, sir." "Any relation to Captain Bradley Reynolds?" The young man nodded. "My uncle. He and my mom didn't always see eye to eye, especially about the changes at the airline. But even he admits now that what you did was necessary." These personal connections, these human stories of change and growth, represented Walter's true legacy, far beyond balance sheets or stock prices. Later that evening, at a gala celebration in Chicago, Walter formally handed the company leadership to Darius. As he placed the symbolic company pin on his grandson's lapel, Walter saw in Darius's eyes the same determination and vision that had driven his own success. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter addressed the assembled crowd, "a year ago, discrimination on an airplane led to a $4 billion response that transformed not just one company, but an entire industry's approach to human dignity. Today, we celebrate not the end of that journey, but its continuation under new leadership." The applause was thunderous as Darius stepped forward. "My grandfather taught me that true success isn't measured by personal wealth or power," Darius began, "but by the positive impact we create in the world around us. Under my leadership, Freeman Global Airways will continue to set the standard for equity, dignity, and excellence in the aviation industry and beyond." As Walter watched his grandson speak, he felt the weight of his years but also the lightness of knowing his work would continue. The transformation he had initiated had taken on a life of its own, extending far beyond what he could have accomplished alone. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation had become the catalyst for systemic change. Walter's response, using his resources not for revenge but for transformation, had created a legacy that would benefit countless travelers and employees for generations to come. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of his vision and the promise of its future, Walter Freeman knew with absolute certainty that his $4 billion response to discrimination had been the best investment of his life. Walter Freeman's story teaches us that true power lies not in retaliation but in transformation. When faced with discrimination, he could have pursued legal action or public shaming, but instead chose to create lasting systemic change. His approach demonstrates that sometimes the most effective response to injustice is to rebuild the system that allowed it to happen. The story also highlights how wealth and influence, when directed toward positive change rather than personal gain, can transform not just one company but an entire industry. Walter understood that discrimination wasn't just a personal affront but a systemic failure that affected countless others without his resources or platform. Perhaps most importantly, Walter's journey shows us that change must be both structural and cultural. New policies alone wouldn't have transformed Meridian Airlines without the parallel commitment to changing hearts and minds. His willingness to offer redemption to those who had wronged him, from Heather Whitman to Captain Reynolds, created space for genuine growth rather than merely punitive compliance. In our own lives, we may not have billions at our disposal, but we all have the capacity to respond to injustice by working toward transformation rather than simple retribution. Walter's legacy reminds us that the most powerful response to discrimination isn't just personal success, but creating systemic change that lifts everyone up. What moment in Walter Freeman's journey resonated with you most? Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination that led to positive transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you to think differently about responding to injustice, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and change. Remember, every one of us has the power to transform our corner of the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and may you find the courage to turn your own challenges into catalysts for positive change.